All right. So welcome everyone to the Literature Colloquium for 2020 on Do the Right Thing. My name is Jeff Middents. I am the interim chair of literature, interim co-chair, along with Kate Wilson. And we all welcome you to the proceedings from today. We have this panel, of course, that's starting at 9:30, and we also have another panel on at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And we hope that you can join us for both of these. We hope you've enjoyed the film as well. We are hoping for lively conversation about this text. We do this, for those of you who are new to this, we do this every year with a different text. We're excited. We picked this movie all the way, this particular text, all the way back in April, and had no idea of what the world was going to bring coming up. We're really proud that we're able to chat about this today in its many forms. Once again, feel free to turn your cameras on if you can. Feel free to leave your cameras off if you wish. But this is not your typical, although we'll be directing questions to the panelists to begin with. At some point, this will turn into a more open discussion, and particularly since we are able to participate in this format, we don't have the opportunity quite this time around. Under a normal colloquium, we would have actually gone out into small discussion groups right before lunch to do that. We won't do that this time, but feel free to enter into this conversation. We do have some questions that were posed ahead of time to all the panelists on the Google Doc, but those are not exclusive. And if you have questions, please feel free to add them into the mix as well, either through the chat function or just raising your hand. I want to thank the two other people who helped organize this and put this together. They are actually on camera right now. Isaiah Washington, who is letting folks in as well on this today, and thank you so much for that. And Professor Shané Weaver, who I see has also made it in, and for the help in terms of putting this together. And without further ado, I will also be moderating this first section, this first panel. In addition to being a panelist here, we have three other people who've we've put together on this panel. Maya Goldenberg, if you want a wave hello, is a first-year student, brave enough to take on the Lit Colloquium in the first semester, her presentation is on sneakers, if you've actually checked this out. Ryan McCauley, on the other end of it, is in his last semester as a student at AU, and his presentation is on Radio Raheem's radio. And Professor Shané Weaver is with us as well. Her presentation on hair and head wraps is also part of this panel. I am the fourth person. I am the person who talked about Night of the Hunter. Putting these four together actually made for an interesting progression, as it were, through different types of objects. I cheekingly titled this one Things in the Right Do, because we're talking about all sorts of different objects, including hair. So throwing the do in was actually the nod there with this. Let's begin. I'm going to actually go to some of the questions here. Professor Pike put a question to the whole panel, and I'll actually, do you want to, Professor Pike, since you're actually here, do you want to pose that particular question to the panel first?
Actually, if you have it open and can read it, that would be more efficient, because I can't confess that I remember it word for word. It was not a short question, like none of
no problem. So his question that starts with, it's a broader question that he actually addresses more specifically to Professor Weaver. He says, you could think of this as a signal/noise question. What is the relationship in the film between the elements of a pattern that pop out? Hair, headwear, radios, illusions, sneakers, and the ones that don't. For example, what about Smiley's apparently busted Walkman in relation to Raheem's boombox? Or the allusion to the French film noir The Raven in the storeroom scenes between the two brothers in relation to the one in Night of the Hunter? In a film that's bursting with information, images, ideas, illusions, and styles, how do we decide what to focus on and what to leave in the background? And that is a really good question to start with. How do you get through? I won't say that this is noise, because, and I'll throw this open to Maya, Ryan, and Shané. That there's
Noise
a lot
is a non-judgmental term, I would add.
True. But how do we pull out particular? Shané.
Okay. All right. So specifically in regard to Smiley and Smiley's character, some people can see him and his quote unquote badgering of Mookie and other characters as something that is noise. And I know Professor Pike said not in a negative connotation, but something that is merely background noise. But what I arrived at, though, of course, is that Smiley, between the pictures that he carries of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and his doodling or his drawings on those, I will venture to say that Smiley can also be read as a figure that represents political awareness of the past, right? And so through his apparent speech impediment or disability, one can see that as a fragmentation of past or previous political movements of the 60s, those that were around in the time of the civil rights era, specifically dealing with violent and nonviolent protests, right? Peaceful and aggressive protests, right? So I think that Smiley's character can be read as a representation of that. And I actually don't enjoy the way that he is dismissed oftentimes by readers or by audiences rather, because his character is silent in a way, but highly, he speaks volumes through symbolism, right? Every time he shows the pictures, when he writes on the pictures, everywhere he goes, when he tries to get someone to include the pictures, right? Even the time that he takes up through his speech impediment, where words take a longer time to come out, right? Is bringing to the fore that people don't, at that point, perhaps in the film within that Bed-Stuy neighborhood, at that moment, perhaps people didn't have the time, quote unquote, to sit and listen or wait or pay attention to some of the political ideology that had emerged from the past, specifically through the civil rights era, as referenced through the constant reflections of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. So I think that the noise of Smiley's character is something that definitely could be, it's relatively quiet, right? And one could say very noisy because oftentimes you can't overtly hear what he's saying, but I think that it's a noise that speaks volumes.
Since we're on Smiley for a moment, and I know that Professor Beasley is also interested in questions of what is Smiley doing here, but Professor Pike also talked about specifically Smiley and his headphones and the Walkman. That was a question that was actually posed specifically to Ryan. Ryan, do you want to take the dichotomy of Smiley's, if it is a dichotomy, between Smiley's Walkman and Radio Raheem's radio?
Yeah, I was also interested in kind of like highlighting that parallel, because I think there's something to be said about the way in which Smiley can participate due to his Walkman and not. If it's busted and you can't get the latest Public Enemy tape, it's like, you know, how in sync are you with what's currently going on in the hood, versus when we see him kind of like dual-fisted, having this like different duality of the past, right, with Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. It's like he's remembering and kind of like asserting, Spike Lee's very committed with his characters, he's asserting a very different kind of, I guess, experience or different memory than what a lot of the characters that are bringing to the table anecdotal, kind of like very neighborhood learned kind of lessons and things like that. I think with more general kind of response to Pike's point about noise and signaling, this movie really is so jam-packed with information. It's almost, you know, totally within the eye of the beholder. What can you take out of it, right? It's so plump and kind of like, there's something so potent about Spike Lee's films and how much he can jam pack in there in terms of like, no, this is what I'm saying, listen to me. But it's also like, you're not going to be the receiver, right? You're not going to be the receiver if you're not tuned into that kind of channel or that string of consciousness or those lessons that Spike Lee's kind of like doling out as the film goes on, right? So.
To go off of Ryan's point about speaking more generally to Professor Pike's question, I completely agree. Like every moment of this movie is jam-packed with like meaning, symbolism, like references. So it's incredibly difficult to find one to focus on. And I think there are like two aspects to finding like an aspect of the movie, not an aspect, sorry, like a symbol or something to hold on to that has meaning. And one of those is repetition. Like that's one way I was able to hone in on the sneakers, is because I felt like it was repeated in front of my eyes multiple times, and it became hard for me to look past that. And then another thing is it depends on what has meaning to you. So what has meaning to you is going to stand out more easily than things that kind of may not relate to you as effectively.
I'll throw out there also the idea that because one of the things that we do within these individual papers is tease out a particular element, the hair, the radio, the references, and you'll see this through like all of the pieces for today. And that's in some ways a way to discreetly do something in a limited period of time for what we're doing for today's event. But I think that this is also that although this is what we do in a way to craft meaning, this does bring the multiple meanings out together, that this is not an exclusionary sort of way, that if we're talking about hair, it doesn't necessarily mean that we are not also talking about music. And that these particular, and one of the joys of this movie is how many references come out, and then as they intersect, really make the text give it the complexity that it does.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Go for it.
So I just flashed on the image that I conclude my talk with, which I hadn't actually thought about in this connection, which is the debris on the night after. And I thought about this listening to Maya, because one of the things in the middle of the image is a tennis shoe, is a sneaker. We also have the ruin of the radio. This goes along connection. So does that openness and plenitude and ability to choose everything survive the moment where all the meaning narrows down to a single horrific moment? Is the ending remain, or in a sense, does something else happen at the end that takes away that ability to pick and choose and see what everyone wants to see? And that is very much not a rhetorical question. But I think it's worth thinking about that the movie changes, the form of the movie changes from that openness that we've been talking about. And I think there's a real question about whether that openness remains afterwards. And it's still there in those things, because I think all the things we've been talking about, I don't know if there are any hats there, but you would assume there are going to be hats there as well. It's all there at the end, but just in a different form.
Yeah, to answer your question, I think, or like more observation, I think that's such an interesting observation, because you're right, we do start out with like so much symbolism, and then it kind of all becomes concentrated at the end to really force the viewer to pay attention to like the specific symbols, like the tennis shoe, like the radio, when it's in that debris. And I think like that's a really effective way of doing it, is with that imagery and that specific picture that you had mentioned.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of different moments for us to kind of insert our own experiences, but also our own understanding of the experiences that were being kind of projected, I guess. And when that all bottlenecks into this moment, I think that we have to kind of like just totally appreciate the magnitude of the totality of the events, the entire neighborhood, the entire block, and how all of these parts kind of like really flesh out this system that is so, you know, boils down to really like this very tiny moment where it's like, in my argument, right, the radio is that boundary crossing, that singular moment that kind of flips the script, where it's like, you know, we don't have a choice to kind of just be open about everything anymore, and we don't have a choice as an audience to be so, you know, pick and choose, right?
Shané, let me actually also, because I also don't remember whether there are hats in that closing sequence, but I'm actually thinking about Mother's sister's hair, and you make a, you know what, just take it from there.
And so that's what I was going to mention. So in that scene in which she's actually crying out, no, right? And she's peering over at, excuse me, at the fire and being comforted by the mayor, right? Who she'd avoided up until this point. But her hair is, at this point, her hair is actually down. You can see more of her hair than you have throughout a lot of the film. And so at this point, we get to see her kind of more open and vulnerable as she's yelling in the screen, in the street rather. So I thought that part was interesting. And then too, there's also one of the let me see, about the third or fourth scene in which we get to see Mookie and Jade in close proximity when they're sitting on the curb, right? And they're just watching, right? And so it's reminiscent of that first scene in which they were that only close up, that one of the most intimate shots of the entire film is between siblings, right? And so we get to see them there together again in grief. But the idea I think that's present is that mother sister in her grief has someone there to comfort her now, the other elder of the community, right? The mayor, right? Who she doesn't again befriend until right before all of this happens. And then we see that Mookie and Jade have each other still, even though Jade complained multiple times, right, throughout the actual film. Before this point, they still have each other in the midst of these ruins as they get to see their community burning down around them, and the trauma of Radio Raheem's murder and all the other things that I'm sure go on that are not directly stated in the community. They still have each other amidst this. So there are some remnants there.
Shané, let me actually even put that a little bit further, because I'm thinking also about the next morning. You mentioned in your piece specifically about her use of the maintenance head wrap. That is different from Jade's head wrap that she's the sort of indoor-outdoor ways. She notably doesn't sleep the night of but she's like, I didn't sleep. And there's a way in which we know that almost because we see her hair still down, or maybe not. I don't. There's the way in which all norms, as David said, are off the table now at this point because she doesn't put on something on her head later, or not. I don't know what you think of that.
So I think that could definitely be read as something that clues into her restlessness, right? Because she did not tie her scarf. Generally speaking, in African American community, you tie your scarf or your bonnet or what have you before you go to bed to preserve your hairstyle. And men do it too, in reference to some men that wear do-rags or years ago, stocking caps to preserve whatever processes that they may have had, or waves or what have you. So one could definitely see that as a clue into her restlessness for that evening, because she didn't do her nightly routine of tying her hair. I think you mentioned this earlier too, something about seeing the mayor without a hat. So when he's with her, his head is still covered, but when we first see him initially in the film, when he's in his own residence, right outside, otherwise he's always outside. But when we see him in his own residence, he's hatless when he's sleeping, right? So that's one of the only other occurrences aside from when he tips his hat to her. But yeah, I think that there's something that can be read about one, her and her restlessness, two, a certain level of vulnerability that we see her engage with, venture into as she engages with the mayor in her personal space, right? The man who she tried to keep at bay for so long. but now she's let him in because he's been seen as honorable to her, you know, over the course of the day.
So there's a question that I've actually gotten. I know that Professor Trembath has to run off, and so if she's not here anymore, we're recording this, so we'll get the answer to this back to her. But she's posed a couple of questions, particularly to Professor Weaver, but I think actually, like, we could take it further, and quite frankly, are going to resonate with another question that Professor Pike makes in the second, to a second set of panelists. The question that she puts is, and I'm reading her words exactly here, I wonder if, directing this to you, Shané, if you could speak to the hair salon and the stoop as a discourse community in the real world. What is the significance of the spaces and the ideas exchanged there? And do you think that Spike Lee was invoking it as such? And I'll say, you know, she mentions the stoop here. The stoop is, I think, something that we're going to want to talk about in particular also in the next panel, but you bring it in here as well.
Yeah, so in my presentation, I do capture talk about or address the notion of the stoop briefly, because I had to capture the interaction too. But the stoop here is a representation of what I call the ubiquitous beauty salon, right? And so in studies of the African-American beauty salon, people often relegate it to 4 walls, right? Which is plausible, totally plausible. But much like other spaces and sacred spaces throughout various cultures, you don't have to necessarily be within those 4 walls to have the elements of that space drawn up, right? And so before, historically, before African-American women were able to have salons in the early 1900s, right? Small salons or what have you. People did do their hair in the confines of their home, right? But if we take it to an African diasporic concept, or put that in that kind of context, or even on the continent itself and in everyday interactions, hair, right, becomes a sacred space whenever more than one women are joined together, and we see some of those specific elements come up. So in the case of a stoop, right, many people have had interactions on a stoop, and like you said, we'll talk about the stoop more. But the stoop here becomes a manifestation of representation of the beauty salon. Mother Sister even says to Jade, that's why you're the only one that I let do my hair, right? And so we see again that specific choosing or that choice to have someone in particular do your hair, to say that this is a sacred bond. I don't just let anyone touch my hair. We even have the exchange of the comments, the question from Mother Sister, are you tender-headed? And Jade concurs and says, yes, I'm tender-headed, right? And so with that being said, we see a common topic come up, right? Which I think can be representative of not only African-American experiences, but also the idea that there are other comments that come up or other topics that come up in interactions within beauty spaces. It's not just, oh, did you curl my hair this way or did you braid it that way, right? It goes beyond those aspects or elements of beautitude. And so I thought that was extremely important. And lastly, we see, and we can frame this in the theoretical concepts of or constructs of Alice Walker, and then being more specific to beauty studies, Lanita Jacobs Huey, other people who capture interactions between African-American women. So in this case, we see ageism totally subverted. And so it also speaks to the people or players or people that participate in the salon space, where we see the mother, right? Mother Sister, right? We see her become the patron, in which Jade, the younger
Shané, unfortunately, I think we lost you momentarily. Okay, hopefully she'll make it back. As a side note, by the way, I don't know if anybody else's ad feeds from Google have been affected by what we've been watching over the last night. But if anyone else is getting the advertisements for the Hulu movie, Bad Hair, which has been coming, which is about to be released. There's, hi, Shané.
Hi. My computer is totally out of whack. I'm sorry.
There's a perfectly like graced moment with your hand like that was framed like for a moment there. As a bridge moment, I was bringing up the fact that it perhaps inspired by your talk last night. At least my Google Ads feed is coming up with a lot of advertisements for Bad Hair, a horror movie that's about to come out right now, which I know that you're going to be eating up, and you need to like have a commentary on that when that comes out, you know, particularly with the spaces here. But sorry, if we lost you at the discussion of the stoop and the ageism that's coming out and the choice that Mother Sister makes with bringing Jade in.
Okay, I do apologize. My computer is strange, but my other device is right here. So, so there in that space, one of the elements of the salon in general, when people study the beauty salon, at least in my work, is that there's so many different people there, women of various ages, from little ones to elders. And so, with that being said, we see the manifestation of representation that a lot of issues that we see in society are subverted in the salon, like ageism, right? And so that's one of the things I was mentioning. So we see Mother Sister, who is the elder, right? Overtly stated as the elder. She becomes someone who is at the whim of, or being provided services through Jade, who is clearly far younger than her, right? And so that being said, we get a glimpse into one of the elements of the salon that is different from many other places, in which the elder is not the person that's in charge. In many other safe spaces, the elder is the person who's in charge oftentimes, or the one who's in charge of certain activities and journeys. And so here we see Jade figured as the person who is in charge, but it's not so much of a hierarchy of roles, right? Because Mother Sister still is involved in telling Jade, ow, that hurts, or what have you, right? So we see that both of these women are in charge. So we see ageism thrown out of the window, right? And so that hierarchy that we see in many other safe spaces does not necessarily exist in beauty salons. And so that's one of the representations that I see here on the stoop of that is reminiscent of the salon space.
I'm so tempted to bring this into a discussion of the stoop in particular, in all of these like spaces that occur. We can actually, we could actually go there because I'm also thinking about, well, Maya and Ryan, both of your pieces actually also deal with stoops and spaces of you know, we have the interaction with Clifton that happens, and you make really good points about the camera angles being used there to actually describe these hierarchies or establish the hierarchies that Professor Weaver has actually pointed out are being subverted there. And Ryan, the space also, the stoop space is also where the battle happens with between the radios, right? There we have the Puerto Rican space. It's one of the only spaces that we have is this particular stoop, where the Puerto Rican boys are having their particular. They're chatting with one another. They're doing whatever they're doing. And I'm also thinking, Professor Weaver, in terms of the space, and particularly with ageism, because we get a different interaction with the mayor, right? Mm-hmm. And how that space, which isn't a stoop, or is it? It's the area that he's sitting, the sort of yard in front, and how that establishes a different hierarchy between young and old. All of these outdoor spaces, how they also interact with these and form these complex communities, almost micro communities. I don't know if you want to, if this is, I'm throwing it out there to all of you, how these different types of uses of these, like the immediately, not the indoor, not the outdoor. And again, I think we're going to go into this afternoon also. The sort of interstitial spaces, contribute to the meaning behind whatever you're looking at.
So I'll just chime in and say that I thought it was interesting how the mayor was not necessarily on the porch during that conversation in which he was approached by Ella and her friends, right? And so he was in another portion of his yard, and I don't want to bring other Lee films into it, but we see that in Crooklyn, specifically with their neighbor, who they had issues with, right, because of his cleanliness. But I wanted to ask Professor Pike, I'm not a New Yorker. And so in the district and in Prince George's County, our stoops look different. So I did live in Southeast for a while as a child. And so our stoop or our porch is different. So Professor Pike, if you could describe that area in New York City that is not the stoop, but it's right there beneath, if you could give us some context with that.
So the space sort of along, well, yeah, all of those are very liminal spaces, I suppose, is what anthropologists call them. They're spaces that belong not to one, they're neither private nor public, which is why they're so interesting. The link I sent in my question is actually a really interesting discussion about the ethical questions that come up about who you allow to sit on your stoop if you own a brownstone. Technically, as far as I can tell, the stoop and all those spaces that are not the sidewalk belong legally to the person who owns the building. But unless they fence them off, which you see a lot in Manhattan now, that they fence them off to keep people from sitting on them, you can't really stop people from sitting on your stoop. And that's what you see with Mother, Sister, and the Mayor. You see that where she tells them to get off her stoop, which in some ways is a very aggressive thing for her to do, given what we've just been talking about. But I mentioned in my post, and I'd like to hear from Ryan and Maya about that. I think the stoop is different though, because it also gives you that elevation. It puts you slightly above, as opposed to the space you're talking about. I'm remembering one scene where the mayor is actually down where people keep their garbage cans, which is the other main thing you have in front of the buildings. You have the stoop, and then you have where you keep the garbage, and sometimes you have basement apartments there, depending on how it's configured. But it's a very New York space. As far as I know, New York is the only city that has stoops to this degree and magnitude, and stoops that are used the way that we see them used in Spike Lee's movies and in other movies with that sort. So I don't really have an answer to your question. I think what we really see is that this is a space that you can use to dramatize conflicts between public and private, which is something that Lee is obsessed with in the movie. Because the contrary version is the plate glass window, which I hope we'll talk about is another way. The whole point of the plate glass window is that it divides. It's a strong division. You can see through it, but you can't stand in the middle. Well, I won't go there because they also have the place where they give the pizza and the takeout thing. You can, in fact, or the Korean grocer that just has a doorway. They don't have a stoop. So it also provides this weird separation between your own space and the public space. But I think it's maybe we can just talk about some of the things that happen in those spaces because he uses them all through the film. And again, it's something that would have been recognizable to especially to his New York audience as something that they were used to, and which I think Lee would have grown up with.
I want to go to Maya and Ryan for a moment, but not before interjecting myself as a participant in this panel, because it dawns on me that this is a way to also address Professor Pike's question from the Google Doc from my piece that references Night of the Hunter, because as it happens, one of the few scenes that I actually bring in there is the porch scene that Rachel Cooper actually brings out and interacts with Reverend Powell in. And Professor Pike was asking about the relationship between mother-sister and Rachel Cooper, which is actually a far more analogous. I think that the analogy I'm trying to make between Radio Raheem and mother-sister, Radio Raheem and Rachel Cooper is a much bigger stretch than mother-sister and Rachel Cooper, in part because of age, in part because of gender here. And there is that connection is strengthened if we take the idea of this porch and who's the positionality on the porch, and issues of power and ownership that go along with that. And I could talk more about Mother Sister, but that's not where we're going right now. Ryan and Maya, take this away. I think Maya, you're up first.
Okay, I actually really love this question because I'm pretty interested in architecture. So when I saw in the comments like Jane Jacob, I was like, yes. And when you were talking about like height in regards to the stoop and what that means, it brings me back to like my favorite scene of the movie, like the scene about gentrification. That's like the one that I've thought about most, is the white cyclist. He goes up the stairs. He's like looking down upon the group of I don't know, like the crowd of young people basically. And that kind of shows his position in society, and like basically a crowd almost like powerless, like trying to get him to listen, but he won't listen. He further retreats up the stairs into a space that becomes more and more private, which brings me back to the stoop. Like I forget, I think it was Professor Weaver who had said, asked Professor Pike to comment on the status of like the, I guess, sidewalk underneath or right by the stoop. So that's kind of like the closer you are to the sidewalk, the more public it gets, and the closer you are to the door, the more private it gets. And that's kind of translated into that scene with the cyclist tries to go up the stairs further and further in order to retreat and get away from that crowd and to like be safe and be able to be in his own space where he's like not being yelled at and not being forced to question his views and his choices.
Ryan, do you want to jump in here?
So my mind is still kind of on a different track of something that you said, just about the way that I think definitely in this movie, Spike's pretty obsessed with the interior exterior and that kind of gray area in between where due to relationships we can kind of flux that line a little bit. And I think that kind of nuance, or that I guess dichotomy, it's not quite, that's the thing, is it's not so bipolar as much of the movie is, but kind of trying to appreciate the private and public in this way. There's a way where you can kind of watch the movie and reject a lot of the private with a character like Radio Raheem, who really kind of brings the story through the neighborhood, and he kind of like meanders a lot more than I think a lot of, like what's Radio Raheem's private, you know what I mean? What's his private space? And so I guess in some ways we can kind of try to urbanize that question a little bit and say he doesn't have one because he lives in the city and because it's the hottest day and blah blah blah, he's got to be on the block walking around fighting the power. But in like a totally different kind of appreciation of his voice or of his agency, I guess, I think we just have to see the way that this kind of like transient interstitching of the neighborhood fluxes the public and private and kind of catapults the private into the public in a way that we don't have a lot of control over. And when that boils over and when that really takes off, we just have to just be like, riot. You know what I mean? Like it gets us to a really interesting place where the private and public aren't simpatico. You know what I mean? With all of these different characters who aren't interrelational in that way.
This was something I wanted to ask you in particular about, in terms of this public, and because the radio, if we take the other radio that's actually in this, and so we have two different types of radios. We've got the boombox, which is what your piece is focused on.
Well, in the radio, right, projecting and receiving, versus the boombox is a loop, man. You know what I mean? The boombox is just that consistent return to the thesis statement, consistent reminder of Rosie, consistent, vibe kind of facilitator, right? We're here. We're right here, and this is how Radio Raheem feels, and this is how Spike Lee kind of feels, even though we have Mookie in the movie, right? Even though we fully have Mookie, I don't know that Spike Lee is as kind of like specifically defined in his I guess, argument or in his stance as he is with Radio Raheem, which is really interesting because Radio Raheem kind of gets all these peripheral kind of, you know, descriptors as like yin and yang and walking in stereo and love and hate, you know, all this like duality, but Raheem's so committed to a very singular, you know what I mean? It's almost monk-esque, you know what I mean? He's very committed to this singular pursuit and this singular kind of like single issue voter of like resistance, right?
Well, and so this is what actually I was curious to know your thoughts about We Love. Because We Love as a radio station is a very different, it does not present a single note. And it's something, but it's also an interior, like this is where we actually do have a very clear divide between the boombox, which is an exterior function, and the radio station that everyone listens to inside. You pointed out, and I hadn't quite gone there, that the grocer is listening in addition to all the different spaces that we see, but the grocer is also listening to We Love Radio, which I had totally missed until you brought it up. But there is a different function, it seems, that's and good grief, how many times have I watched this movie, and I love finding these things, you know, with it. But what do you do with We Love in these spaces, and how is that? Is this a different form of radio? How is this a different form of radio? Yes.
So just quickly, I think We Love is interesting because definitely there's this moment where we get the, you know, his tagline, Mr. Senior Love Daddy, on in the grocery store. But then there's also this moment where they put the needle on the record and start playing the record. And before we hear it, that's when it cuts to the Salsa Boys. So there's this way in which we can kind of appreciate We Love as a kind of voice of the neighborhood. You know what I mean? But it's also this information stream where you have to go and get it. You know what I mean? You have to like go somewhere to hear it, which is kind of inversely relational to the way that everybody wakes up to it. You know what I mean? You're kind of like, that's your homeostasis, and then you're moving on from that and going through the day. And somebody like Raheem, who is projecting, right? A boombox is about community in some respects, right? Other people to hear, b-boys to dance to, whatever you want to, you know, MCs to rock on. Like there's something about a boombox that is very communal and very of this moment. It's very temporal, right? You know, we've been talking about how do you replace the boombox, because the boombox is this perfect kind of like parallel element to the kind of like, right? There's no object for the radio. The radio is a path of communication between Mr. Senior Love Daddy, who has this very interesting glass wall kind of separation from the actual community. Like he keeps talking about how hot it is, but I don't think he leaves the AC, you know what I mean? So it's like, there's this kind of interesting moment where we have to appreciate where characters are bringing their experience into the fold of public kind of discourse, I guess.
So there are any number of different ways in which we go here. Part of me is wondering, since again, Professor Pike was around in the 1980s, what kind of boombox did he have? Because, you know, there's like, you know, and the various different versions of the 1980s. I had one, but, you know, I didn't carry it around because I am not even remotely cool. And there's a way in which there would be a really interesting like paper to look at another seminal 1980s movie that uses a boombox prominently, which is Say Anything, only in one scene and a very different way. But this would be like, your task, Ryan, is to now remake your video essay with like Say Anything's piece in it. I wanted to turn actually also to another question to Professor Weaver, actually about Mr. Senior Love Daddy. Because, and these interior, since we're talking about interior exterior spaces, one of the things you pointed out was the use of hats in particular, and particularly the hats by the men on the, like the various different men's hats, the boat hat in particular, and the three men on the corner, how their hats are sort of signifying their work elements and the different ways in which they travel. And you bring up the fact, and I love the fact that you brought up the image of Mr. Senior Love Daddy and all of his hats. But then his hats are also like the Panama hat. I went back after I looked at that picture then because I was like, doesn't he have a boat hat? No, it's a Panama hat. And there's like all of these and the different hats that he has. But he has hats that also sort of seem to symbolize this travel. And yet the one person who does not move in this movie, other than Tina, which I think is really interesting, and I would love to talk more about Tina with this. But Mr. Senior Love Daddy, he's the vision on everyone else, but he's very interior oriented. But his hats say otherwise. Or does it? Like, what do you make of Mr. Senior Love Daddy's traveling hats?
So
Are they
like
just
you
for
said,
show?
so he had a myriad of hats that I believe were matched with or aligned with the shifts that we see in the plot. And so, like you said, one of them was a Panama hat. He had a safari hat. He had a top hat. He had a cap with a brim that had Pan-African colors on it and stripes. He had the Afrocentric, literally Afrocentric kufi that read Afrocentric with cowrie shells. And so we see him in an abundance of hats. He even had a cowboy hat at a certain point in which it was actually specifically at the point in which they took off the fire hydrant. They opened the fire hydrant, and he also had some sunglasses that squirted water, right? And so, with that being said, I think that his hats are indicative of the ideas that he brings into the elements of the plot, right? And so, although he doesn't travel, it's like this really ironic thing. He literally never leaves the studio, but his hats indicate different elements. I think it can also be read to make the story of what we see here and do the right thing on this hot day in Bed-Stuy pertinent to so many other aspects of life, right? We know that many of the hats there have functional aspects. And so one thing too that I appreciate about this and how I feel like his hats tie into a Black aesthetic is that from many Afrocentric theories, specifically those postulated by like Malefi Asante, Dr. Malefi Asante, the idea that African art should be functional, right? And so we see these different hats that Senior Love Daddy is wearing, that a lot of those hats are functional in real life. So the history of the Panama hat, for instance, right? It's actually, the history actually lies in Ecuador, right? In reference to people utilizing the hat for work, right? Utilizing the hat during work for a drinking mechanism, or the fact that the hat was constructed there and then popularized elsewhere. So we get a lot of narratives and history behind these hats, right? And these hats that are used for work. And like you mentioned with the men, Sweet Willie and Coconut Sid and ML, these men in their hats, which have a very ironic relationship to them, and the fact that they are, again, we don't see them move much except for to go to the store and to come back. And then at the end, we do see them, with the community when they walk down the street a bit. But nonetheless, we see this ironic use of hats specifically with them because the hat spoke to their character, right? Sweet Willie's fedora and his fedora, and the idea that fedoras were associated with like swagger, right? And he swear he's a ladies' man, right? So ML and his bucket hat, and he's seemingly one of the more cool, calm people until he gets upset and he tries to aggressively address the Korean store owners, right? And he's quickly helped to like, they're okay, right? And then also with Sid's cap, right, which is oftentimes worn by men in the working world to keep the sun out of their eyes. But Sid is one of the people who overtly is badgered for not having a job, right? So it's very interesting how those hats were explored in that way. There was two, and I'm going to make sure I put it into the into the chat here because my computer's back running. There was a question, I don't know if I can pose it to Ryan, that dealt with music and radio. Oh, I'm sorry. And one more thing, Professor Middens, you mentioned about Tina not leaving the home, and I did see also, I think it was your question, Professor Pike, about the lack of hair care, right? Overt hair focus amongst other people, right? That were not African American in the film or of the African diaspora more overtly. And so Professor Middents, to deal with your question, your comment about Rosie Perez's character first, Tina. Tina, I recognized when I rewatched, there was one time when she left the house, once. And it was when that mother, what is Eddie, the little guy named Eddie that the mayor saved from getting hit by a car. Tina is there with Hector. Tina is there with Hector for like 2 seconds as there are other people that are looking in on this woman chastising her child and trying to figure out what happened. And I thought that it was interesting that they brought her into another maternal conversation, right? But that is the only time that we see Tina. I said, oh, there goes Tina. She's right there, like kind of in the background, as one of the onlookers for this scene. So so yeah, she's there just in a passing cursory kind of way. And with the other hair, so I did actually, when I started, I thought maybe I could leave this for a different conversation. So in regards to Professor Pike's question with Tina specifically, I actually started to do a write-up on her hair in regards to the opening scene, right? Her dance sequence. I think that it may have been something that they did intentionally, but Tina's hair, as she's fighting the power, literally, her hair is on point, right? It literally doesn't change. And so thinking about another movie I taught in a different class, Imitation of Life, we laughed at one point in which a woman's hair went from being wet in the 1950s version, right? The mom, her hair went from being wet from the snow, and then when she gets back in the house, it's automatically dry, right? So my students and I laughed about it, but with Tina, she's working up a sweat, fighting the power, and her curls are intact the entire time, right? So I think there's something to be said to the resilience of her too. And then even with the Puerto Rican males who are on the porch, right? We see them kind of toy at one person. They harass him about his hat briefly, right? He's the only guy that's wearing a hat, a black cap, right? And they harass him about his cap briefly. But I think that there is certainly a certain level of attention that can be paid to hair and hats and things amongst the Puerto Rican characters in the film too. I just didn't include them there, and especially because diasporically, there's a connection, between Africans and Puerto Ricans too. So there's something to be said there, right? But there's no overt focus, but there's a testament to Rosie's hair. On this hot day, it goes unchanged, right? Tina's hair, I'm like, dag, right? And we know that humidity attacks, right? But her hair is completely unchanged, right? So there's something there. And Ryan, I want to direct this question to you. So we see with the radios, right? Radio Raheem's radio, and then Senior Love Daddy. I kind of had a question. I'll pop this into the document as well. The question asks if you could kind of narrate the relationship between Senior Love Daddy's music and that of what's coming from Radio Raheem's music. What do you believe is the relationship between there? I don't want to put anything on you in regard to my thought, but I think that there's a unique relationship there where the songs that are being played by Senior Love Daddy are one thing thematically, right, and even sonically, and then we have Radio Raheem's music. So did you see anything there, or can you narrate the relationship between those two elements and what role they may play in the plot?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that kind of as I've touched on a little bit, and I'm, open to getting more panelists' opinions to kind of dive deeper into this. But for me, the way that kind of not only does Raheem operate and interact with the rest of the kind of community, I guess, is in my mind consistently driven by Spike Lee. You know what I mean? It's consistently driven by the powers that are kind of like outside of the community a little bit. I think that there's a lot to be said about the moment where Raheem is talking to Bugging Out, and he says, you don't listen to Public Enemy. It's like the only tape I got because it's the only thing I listen to. And I think that's a really interesting moment where we have to be like, well, what does everybody else listen to? Is everybody else really just listening to We Love? Because if so, that's not necessarily explicitly shown other than people waking up to it. You know what I mean? Which to me is not necessarily like, oh, I'm going out of my way to interact with my community, right? I think the waking up to Mr. Senior Love Daddy is kind of just like that instantaneous reconnecting to like, oh, I gotta go back on the street. Raheem's checking in with Mr. Senior Love Daddy as he's walking by in the morning. And so I think the way in which they're separate is very specific, right? Raheem's boombox is tied to the tape, the singular song, if we even get the verses of the, of Fight the Power. And Mr. Senior Love Daddy's music is not explicitly kind of like gifted to us in this way. And it's also not explicitly interacted on by other characters as something worthwhile. And so I think Raheem's commitment to that as this kind of like ethos really just like, hits us in this way where we're like, yeah, fight the power, man. Like, yeah, yes, like Raheem's back, his theme song's on, you know what I mean? And we're in this moment. But then when we're at that juncture where we have to fight the power, and when the radio's smashed and Raheem is silenced, Raheem has to turn into Raheem now. You know what I mean? He's not Radio Raheem, right? And so for me, I don't know that Mr. Senior Love Daddy has that same kind of like weaponizing agency of his voice. You know what I mean? Whereas Raheem is a cog of the community, is well respected and acknowledged by everybody. And if you don't, he'll get in your face and tell you, D motherfucker. But then there's also this furthering of it where he has to back up his thesis. He has to back up his tagline, his fight the power in that moment, right? And it's driven 1/10 of the degree beyond this kind of like safe space of confining your voice to a radio, right? Confining your voice to something that's easily intelligible or easily kind of digestible by others.
So Ryan, if I could briefly follow up on that, you mentioned earlier, I think the one exception to the point that you made, which is the salsa song, that Senior Love Daddy starts on the turntable, which then plays on the boombox, and then instigates the boombox duel between Radio Raheem's Public Enemy and what you've just suggested would be the world of the radio station, right? So I think that's another way to think of what's being staged in that battle of the boomboxes. Because as far as I'm remembering, the sound goes over, and so it suggests that they're actually listening to Senior Love Daddy. That seems unlikely because that's the only salsa song he plays. But that seems to be what the sound is telling us, right?
If we want to read it like that, I think it's definitely there. But I think there's this other way in which, it is kind of a storytelling device to just kind of like be able to flip from one thing to the other. Because it does seem inconsistent, right? It does seem like that's maybe not necessarily something, Mr. Senior Love Daddy is going to play. And then also I think that there's a furthering kind of notion where it's like, really what we, in my opinion, really what we get from Mr. Senior Love Daddy is Mr. Senior Love Daddy, not We Love's music or We Love's programming, right? We really get him as like a figure with an opinion, and he's kind of like almost acting like a narrator, interjecting, definitely kind of have like a Gatsby eyes sort of a thing, right? That kind of a vibe. But I think that like, again, going back to Radio Raheem and flipping that, Radio Raheem is like kind of like protecting his space by going down this, kind of little loudness wars battle with the sorry, I'm trying to like read the chat and talk. When he's going down the loudness wars little rabbit hole with the boombox, I think that there's a lot to be said about maintenance of his kind of like corner and like protecting his block and his space where his voice is projected. Because I think to allow them to play their salsa music, blah, 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 that is the complete antithesis of what Raheem's about, what Lee's about, and what I would say this community seems to be projecting within their block. right?
I want to throw, I
Yeah,
want to,
so much of it is diegetic and non-diegetic. It's so hard to like make heads or tails of it. Sorry, just responding to that.
no, there's also, I mean, I think that it's kind of, this leads me into another direction that pulls, I think, all, particularly the three of your pieces together in some ways. Because I think, Shané, the particular like, distinction that you're making between Public Enemy on one side and We Love's music on the other is very distinct. And actually, Sandra, your comment about that Branford Marsalis is also put into this. The place where they come together, however, is in the roll call, where the roll call mentions both. It mentions all of it. Public Enemy is within the roll call. So is EU. So Go-Go is in the mix there as well. In addition to voices that we don't hear because they're too expensive, right? So we don't get Whitney Houston, we don't get Mariah Carey, we don't get Michael Jackson. All three of them are the biggest people of the 1980s, and they can't be in the movie except mentioned in Mr. Senior Love Daddy's roll call because they're too expensive. They surely could not afford them for this movie. Which speaks to something, and this is sort of a slightly convoluted way, but not really, to the idea of the commodification of all of these elements and what elements of, in some ways, you know, Professor Negron the other day was also talking about the commodification of Black culture and how, particularly how capitalism runs through this. Ryan, in your case, you've got the radio, the dueling radios, and how much so clearly Radio Raheem's radio is so much bigger and better, and clearly also more expensive than everything else. Maya, your sneaker, I mean, the whole discussion about the sneakers is about how these $100 sneakers are broke. You know, you might as well throw them shits out. And Shané, in some ways, this is a question I sort of posed to you, I think, in it was this morning, so it's okay for not. But yeah, you mentioned, but we never see the movie references that there's a Jerry curl alert and that there is a, you know, and it's funny. It's like a hilarious, like early hilarious moments. It's like your head will turn into a helmet forever. You know, this is this. And yet, of course, we don't actually see anyone with the Jerry curl. There is no processed hair, with the exception maybe of Tina, which again, that's a separate issue. But actually, the celebration of natural hair, like through the movie, which is awesome, also belies the fact that it's like, well, is this because it's hot and because indeed this is a Jerry curl alert, so stay at home in front of the icebox, otherwise your head's going to melt? Or is this also an indication about class with hair, that the processed hair is not seen on this block at all? We've got fades. Now, there's another question, is the issue of fades and how, like, you know, that's going to, you make the great analysis, I think, that there's an age divide there also working with the use of fades. But there's a question there, like all of these come up with issues of money, like, and how is money being chosen to be spent, both by the movie and by like the characters within the movie? Like, where is the money going? So I'm throwing out there like issues with the money. Go with that.
Okay. So, of course, the beauty industry has brought a certain level of economic development to African American communities, right? Because people were able to be autonomous and do their own thing, either working within a company or working independently. Whether you get people selling products from Madam C.J. Walker or various other companies, like Dudley, that's actually based out of North Carolina than DC. So you get that autonomous economic possibility, right? However, there are certain things, processes or styles that can definitely be outside of one's budget. And so I think within the realm of the community that we're dealing with here, I would venture to say there are probably people who get their hair done. You know, some people that are in the background. Even Ella, somebody asked a question in the doc actually about Ella's hair. Even Ella's hair is done, right? We can still see that somebody curls her hair underneath of her cap, right? And even Tina's hair. And I would venture to say, can't be too sure, right? Tina's hair may not have had necessarily been chemically processed either. It could have just been, you know, straightened and curled. So, you know, we don't know.
It is the 1980s, and there is so much mousse in that hair, because mousse is all that we used. We did. But you're right.
Yeah.
No, keep going. Yeah.
So we see that that people's hair may have been done on its own. We even see that mother sister goes to who to do her hair? Jade. She didn't walk down the street to a salon or what have you. Jade, can you do my hair really quick? And we do know that oftentimes when you ask, when you don't visit a professional, as in a licensed professional, you can either get a discount, somebody might even be able to do it totally for free, right? Or you can barter, right? You can give somebody something and they can give you something back. And so we actually do see that a lot in the beauty industry. And in regard to the men's fades, and Professor Pike posed this question, in regards to the men's fades, none of them, Bugging Out, Mookie, Radio Raheem, none of their fades were regular fades, as in just a traditional, you know, either a bald fade with a number one here, or even a fade. They had hardline fades, but or even a fade with the different guards and different levels, you know, going down. None of them had regular fades. Everybody had a design, right? And so designs are a premium in most barbershops, as in that's not your basic cut. So when I go above the average, you are going to pay an extra price. And so one would venture to say that the men in this film totally get their haircut. That's not something that people are doing on their own. Now there are talented people who can do it on their own, but in most cases, right? And given the ornate designs in their hair, they were visiting a barbershop, perhaps even the same one, the same, you know, metaphorical barbershop, because some of the cuts, the shapes that are in Bugging Out's hair, you can also see those in Radio Raheem's hair. They're different, but you can see some of that. And so Moogie just has a simple line to go with his hard fade and a cut and a part here, but you can see that they may have had the same barbershop, the same barber, right? But there's definitely an extra premium, especially with Bugging Out's rat tail. He could have wrapped it himself, right? But his rat tail is lengthy and it also is wrapped in Pan-African colors, right? And so he could have done it himself, but he could have definitely visited a shop or a barbershop. And so one could say that the men here are clearly dealing with some outside maintenance. But the women on the other side, we don't necessarily see that, right? Even the mom who comes in, Eddie's mom who comes in and reprimands him on the street, her hair just like in a ponytail, which looks like it could have just been blow dried and, you know, put in a ponytail. Eddie's little fade though is there, right? His hair is being cut by someone. So we do see that the men whose hair is maintenance, even the Puerto Rican guys, their haircuts are maintenance, right? Their hair is done. And so I don't know if anybody's ever visited a Dominican or Puerto Rican barbershop, right? But the cuts are pristine, okay? So the men's hair is done. We see a range of styles with them too. Some people have shorter hair, some people have longer hair. And so the men in this film, their hair is definitely being maintenance, but the women, we aren't too sure. It might be something that's being done at home. And so also I wanted to throw a little bit of something out there that might more so go with Maya's piece. And Maya, there's a question I have for you too, and I'll pop it into the doc. But it had to deal, the question I have for Maya had to deal with economics, right? And so Maya, you talked about the Jordan sneaker quite well, right? So, but with the Jordan sneaker, part of it too, I would venture to say, is with consumerism. I wanted to ask a few questions about that, but consumerism, the African-American community, how much money is spent, whether it's in the beauty industry, and people often critique the lack of control that African-Americans have had although they contribute significantly to the fashion industry and the beauty industry. So I had just a question about the Jordan sneaker, which has been, I don't know how much it costs. I don't know if you might be able to answer this, how much that sneaker cost then, but the sneaker has been dragged and ridiculed because of the price, right? So in the early 90s, there was a lot of violence surrounding the shoe and other items because they were considered to be luxury because they were outside of the price of his major consumer base, right? And so I wanted to kind of speak to that. And then a little bit about Eddie, which I thought was cool in reference to fashion. Eddie actually has on a shirt that gives a little credence to go-go. It says the butt on it. So I thought that was a cool little tidbit. And of course he had EU in school days, right? Doing part of the school there. So, but Maya, I don't know if Professor Middents can kind of navigate where we go with the economic discussion. Did you see anything specifically about Jordans and economics?
Yeah, actually I did. And I wanted to look up a conversion of the price from like the 1989 to today, just to get it like in perspective. So they had said that he spent $100, which was like likely marked up because I think that I had read that when released, they were like $65 or something like that. And it goes into the culture of like it being difficult to find. And like part of the uniqueness of sneaker culture and early sneaker culture was the hunt. That was like part of the joy. And I had read that was especially prevalent in New York City. And so you can kind of see that with the elevation of the price. And then $100 then I had read that it translates to $208 to $213 today. And a really interesting scene to look at and compare the amount that he spent on the shoes is when he was in Sal's Pizzeria. And I believe he was talking about like the markup when he wanted to add something onto the pizza. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was like maybe a couple dollars or like a few quarters or something cheese. Yes, that's what it was. Yeah, $2. And then he just decided to shake the cheese on. Yeah. And so it's like really interesting to look at how much he's willing to spend on sneakers versus how much he's willing to spend on pizza. And it shows like how much he really, really values the way he presents himself to the people around him. And I believe it was Professor Middens. Oh, sorry. What is it? Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's just different because so much of it is online now. And like with all the like bots and stuff like that for when they're released and the lists and just it being complicated. But anyways, it definitely has changed. But going back to what I was saying, I believe Professor Middens had asked me about his political identity and then also consumerism and like how those two things come together. And I think that it's supposed to be, or at least I'm interpreting it as being ironic, because if anyone were to be aware of the problems around consumerism, marketing to the Black community, like exploitation, things like that, it would be the most political character who, in my opinion, is bugging out, but he's not aware of that. And he actually like goes in the opposite direction and actually celebrates consumerism and actively participates in it and considers that a part of his identity. And that brings me to think that, you know, we're so blind to the woes of consumerism. And that's kind of what those two aspects of his personality come together to highlight. Sorry, I'm not looking at the chat. So
the chat is going into the hunt also with all that and how much the hunt and these particular like aspects of sneakers. Maya, you mentioned this is actually in passing, but also and when you mentioned this to me earlier, I was like shocked with this because I missed the 30th anniversary Do the Right Thing sneakers. The horror of pre-scuffed sneakers and what that means. Do you want to talk about those pre-scuffed, the 2019 version of Air Jordans?
So I was just like doing a preliminary research, just like Googling things about his shoes, just so I could learn a little bit more. And I happened upon this article that was like, look at these Jordans, limited release, blah, blah, blah. We don't know when they're going to come out, but they've been released to, apparently there's like some like family and friends thing, like sort of membership that you can get that's like very exclusive within Nike. And so it was only released to like a very, very small group of people, and they ended up not releasing it on a larger scale. And so these shoes are like incredibly rare, and only for a very like dedicated specific group of like consumers of sneaker culture. And I think that that's so interesting. One thing, just that it's like so exclusive, and it kind of plays into the idea that like that's kind of what made them special to Bugging Out in the movie, is like the exclusivity, the price, like, and the like combination with that and his identity. But the whole pre-scuffed thing was very surprising to me, because like I'd said, once they become scuffed, it's like they become a symbol of gentrification. And I don't know if that's just the way that I'm looking at it, or if that's the way that like the general population that watches the movie views it. But either way, they're like packaging that symbol and like selling it or like gifting it to these like really highly valued group of people to the company, and saying like, wow, look how special these are. And in doing so, they're completely ignoring the meaning that I perceived behind the shoes, and almost celebrating like the gentrification, the symbol of gentrification in the movie. It's kind of bizarre.
We are almost out of time here. I'm realizing, and we could keep going. In fact, we want to keep going on. I should throw out, if there's anyone who hasn't gotten a chance to ask a question yet, please do at this point. There may be many questions out there that we've been going back and forth between. Ryan's comment about, that's almost as much as 20D batteries. That is significant. That's one of the things about maintaining a boombox, is the constant need to bring in batteries into this as well, right? That you need, there is, again, one of the parts of this consumer culture. Yes, please put it in the chat as well. Or the Google Doc, if you have questions for the afternoon panelists as well, please go to that as well. But this particular, attention of all of this, how commerce works on this block, and how different elements. We haven't even talked, like, there's of course the moments in passing that goes by this. The shaved ice vendor versus the ice cream vendor coming in, and what happens, as that's, as the kids get lured away by this, by the newfangled packaged ice cream treats. There are all sorts of different ways in which we can go. Any final thoughts from any of the panelists?
I think doing this read or analysis of the film was interesting. I've watched the film several times, right? But I think with this attention to hair, it also allowed me to be more attentive to several other aspects. Hence, I was able to see Rosie Perez's character outside of the home, and I never saw her there. And so there's so many other elements that I think that can be analyzed, especially in regard to other marginalized people represented in the film and the interactions therein. So I think that there's still a wealth of areas that we can look into, and I encourage everybody to do so. Professor Middents, I was typing in the chat. I had one brief question for you. So you compared the Christianity, and I believe the film is The Hunter, right? I might be saying it wrong.
Night of the Hunter.
Night of the Hunter. I apologize. Night of the Hunter. You mentioned the Christian theme, but then you also said something about Radio Raheem being able to be read as a Christian symbol. Do you think that are there any other excuse me, God, right? Not necessarily Christian, but any other God-like characters in Do the Right Thing? And then do you think that that Radio Raheem's was specifically picked to be the only figure like that? Because I didn't see any other overt religion or religious references. So I was just curious about your take on that.
So two things about that. One, actually, what I said was that I viewed him as a moral center in the same way that Rachel Cooper is. That she's sort of this character that we in a den of all sorts of chaos, because Night of the Hunter has very ineffectual adults, like throughout, particularly the adults, and these kids are just desperate for someone to hang on to be moral. And there's a way in which Rachel Cooper definitely in a movie that has actually a lot of black and white, and not just visually, but the things are either good or bad, and Rachel Cooper is clearly the good one here. And there's a way in which I'm making a provocative statement, I think, in looking at Radio Raheem as that character that might outwardly be conceived otherwise, again, more like Reverend Powell and more like an antagonist. What if we actually view him the way that he's filmed, which is actually, although we get a lot of canted angle close-ups of him, but we don't get him in chiaroscuro. We don't get him the same way that Pino is actually filmed. He's actually filmed very sympathetically. So what I'll say is I didn't indicate him as a God factor, but now that you mention it, he is of course the one that is sacrificed in a way so that we can move forward. I hadn't thought about this until you just mentioned this now, that actually this could be read, is Radio Raheem not God, but Jesus in this respect, like, and actually that is in the sequel, is in the non-sequel to this movie, does Radio Raheem rise up again? And as Professor Negron said the other day, that's what's happening now in 2020, that the legacy of Do the Right Thing, the what happens next is now. Like, sad that you can't hear this. Well, it'll be on the it'll be on the recording of this, which we'll get out there as well with this. I'm gonna have to think about that myself more, because I'm very intrigued with that. Yes, actually, Smiley in front of the church there's an interesting quick rejection of the two characters of the Jehovah's Witness characters that we get, when Mookie comes out of his house and says, hell no, and we only see them and they go away. There are some interesting things if we looked at this, the film, which none of us have, in this, through the realm of Christianity in particular, I think it would yield very interesting results. But I don't think we have time for that right now. That'll be for the next colloquium in terms of what's going on here. I want to make sure that we have enough time just in case. Just as a public service announcement, there is both the second panel of this colloquium is happening starting at 1 o'clock. This gives you plenty of time, by the way, in a half an hour, just under half an hour. Professor Lily Wong is giving a talk for the Exploring Social Justice series from Bender Library. And tonight, Cambodian American poet Monica Suk will be part of the Visiting Writers series. It is a day when you can spend all day doing lit-oriented stuff. I want to very much thank Maya Goldenberg, Ryan McCauley, and Shané Weaver for being on this panel with me. And we can continue this. I'll keep the room open if we want to keep having this discussion now, but this is also a good point to say thank you to everyone. If you need some time away and have a bit of a break before, and we really do hope that you come back for the afternoon session where we'll have a whole other set of topics. That one will be moderated by Paul Falleri as well. So thank you. I will turn the recording off here, and we can keep going if you want to keep chatting. But if you need to run off, thank you very much for participating today, and bravo to the rest of the panel.